But a couple of broad areas. On immigration, the president signed executive orders very quickly, ordering the government to look at reunifying families that had been separated at the border, changing our asylum rules, changing our public funds rules. The Trump administration had passed a law that said you couldn't apply for asylum or you couldn't immigrate to the United States if it looked like you might need public funds or public assistance. They got rid of that. They got rid of the Muslim ban, and they halted work on the border wall on the southern border. On healthcare, they immediately signed executive orders to make it easier to enroll in the Affordable Care Act and to extend the enrollment period. On the environment, lots of executive orders around canceling the Keystone oil pipeline project, putting the United States back into the Paris Climate Agreement, orders making the environment and climate change in general central to US foreign and domestic policy. And then this was not an executive order, these are personnel appointments, but I'll just note on climate change and the environment, the appointments of Gina McCarthy as head of domestic climate change policy and John Kerry as head of foreign climate change policy, a very, very experienced and effective team that will make sure that climate change is central to all US policies, foreign and domestic, for the next 4 years. Equity was a big issue during the campaign, a big talking point. So the president signed executive orders on things like fair housing, getting rid of private prisons, repealing the ban on transgender service people serving in the military. On the economy, he signed an order to strengthen the Buy America Act, which requires that the government basically make most, if not all, of its purchases from American firms. To an extent that our Canadian neighbors who had a waiver from the old Buy America Act are somewhat concerned that they might be excluded from purchases by the American government. And then finally, on COVID, and again, the president had promised he would do this, he issued nationwide transportation mask mandates and the mandating of wearing a mask on federal property. He's making more extensive use of FEMA to help with the COVID vaccine rollout. And rejoin the World Health Organization. So again, a lot of anger, I think, on the part of Republicans on the Hill that the president has done so much through executive order. But again, just to note that this is fairly typical and not at all unusual. And it's a way for him to very quickly fulfill some of his campaign promises. So moving to the current mood in Washington right now, President Biden, as I'm sure you all know, came into office pledging, and I think to a certain extent convinced himself that he could heal the sort of bipartisan bitterness in Washington and use his extensive experience in the Senate, where he was known for working well across the aisle with his Republican counterparts, to create sort of a new mood in Washington where Republicans and Democrats would be able to work together and address the health crisis and the economic crisis in our country. It's not working. Washington is as partisan as it's ever been, is as bitter as it's ever been, and I see no signs of that changing. The impeachment hearings and trial did not help, but essentially the Republican Party is firmly in Trump's control at this point. And if it wasn't clear before, it was certainly after we saw President Trump's reception at the Conservative Political Action Convention in Florida this past weekend. He was the conquering hero and was treated as such. Many Republican lawmakers, I think, are deeply uncomfortable with Trump and his hold on the party and his influence on the party, but they are afraid of alienating his base, and they need his base to continue to stay in office. So they're walking a fine line between trying to keep a little bit of distance from some of the former president's pronouncements while not alienating his very, very loyal and deep base. So we think President Trump will continue to be a kingmaker in the Republican Party, certainly through the 2022 midterm elections. I note that he's already encouraging challengers to some of the representatives who voted against him in the impeachment hearing. And another indication of his continued hold on the party is the fact that state parties have been censoring members and senators from their state who voted against Trump. So if we needed any more signs that President Trump is in control of the party, we have them. We think that very little will get passed in the Senate and in the House this year. The Democrats will have to use a process called the budget reconciliation process to get anything done. And even that is tough to get done with such small majorities, there's almost no chance of any legislation getting 60 votes. The Republicans in the House and the Senate are 100% focused on winning back both the Senate and the House in the midterms next year. And by the way, traditionally, the opposition party tends to gain seats in the midterm elections, first midterm elections after a new president comes into power. And they see their way of ensuring that, their way of winning back seats is to block Joe Biden's agenda. And we're already seeing this on the Hill. And one thing that I'll note is, and that is a little bit overlooked, is that the White House talks a lot about bipartisanship still today, but they've changed the definition of bipartisanship a little bit. Bipartisanship used to mean that members of the opposite party support the legislation that you're proposing on the Hill. And what the White House is, the way they're using that word now is to refer to public sentiment. So for example, when they say the stimulus package, which was passed in the House with no Republicans voting for it Saturday morning and is now in the Senate, when they say that that bill has bipartisan support, what they're talking about is that 75% of voters, including 60% of Republicans, support it, not that any Republican senators or representatives support it. So what we're going to see from this White House is a lot of talk about bipartisanship, but they're not talking about the legislatures on the Hill. They're talking about the American people supporting the packages that they're putting forward. So what's next on the horizon? First and foremost, stimulus, as we've been saying. The Democratic goal is to pass it by mid-March when some of the benefits which are currently available to American people expire. That's an ambitious timeline, but it's certainly possible. They've got about 2 more weeks to do that. It passed in the House, as I said, early Saturday morning. The Senate is working on it now. The Senate will change it. The House passed a part of their bill said that there would be a $15 minimum wage. That will not survive the Senate. It'll be taken out. The Senate will make other changes. They'll probably decrease the size a little bit. It's about $1.9 trillion now. We think it'll come down to probably 1.5 to 1.7. And then it'll go back to the House for them to vote on the new version. And we think they will do that. It's a tough balancing act for the leaders in the House and especially in the Senate between progressives who want to use this bill to push for really aggressive progressive policies, and moderates, including senators like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema in Arizona, who are very uncomfortable with some of the more progressive policies. So they have to walk a very fine line given the 50-50 setup in the Senate. They can't afford to lose any of the Democratic senators. Anyway, but this will all happen over the next week or two, and it will get passed in the Senate, passed in the House. The president will sign it into law, we think, by the sort of 3rd week or so of March. The bill does include, just really quickly, stimulus checks of $1,400 to many, or if not most, Americans, continued extension of emergency unemployment insurance, money for vaccine rollout across the country, money for opening schools, money to continue to support small businesses. So there's a lot in there for America, which explains why the measure itself is so popular with voters. Then the next 2 big initiatives for the rest of the year for President Biden are tax reform and infrastructure. On taxes, they're also probably going to have to do this through reconciliation, and sorry, I didn't explain this, and I'm happy to go into detail if people want afterwards. But reconciliation is a process which is available to the party to use basically twice a year, once for spending bills and once for revenue bills, in a way that allows them to pass a bill with just 51 votes. So they don't need any Republicans. So if the Republicans say we're not going to vote for anything, they can still get a little bit done through reconciliation. Stimulus is getting done by reconciliation now. That's the spending bill for this budget year. Taxes will be the revenue portion of that for this fiscal year. And what they want to do is raise the corporate tax rate from its current rate to up to about 26 to 28%, raise some corporate taxes on foreign earned income. And on the personal side, we think the top earners rate of people making over $400,000 a year will go up to about 39%. And they're looking at raising the estate tax and lowering the exemption level for estate taxes. There'll be a lot of other stuff in the initial bill that comes out. But at the end of the day, because of the close margin in the Senate and the House, they're going to have to really kind of moderate it and make it more of a not quite as ambitious a tax package. And we think, and we're about the only firm in the US that's saying this right now, we think the corporate tax changes may be retroactive to January 1st of this year. And a lot of people say, and they push back on that, and they say, why would the administration push for raising taxes when the economy is just coming out of recession and after this terrible health and economic crisis? But the Biden team honestly and sort of sincerely and passionately feels that they have to raise revenue for all these spending programs. And the way to do that is to reverse some of the Trump era corporate tax changes and to tax the wealthiest Americans. And again, if you go into Main Street America and you say, we're talking about raising taxes on people making over $400,000 a year, most Americans are on board with that. It doesn't affect them. And they're happy to see the richest Americans pay more. And for the Biden team, this is sort of a moral issue that the richest Americans and the corporations should pay more to help dig the economy out of this situation that we're in now in this recession. So we do think that they are determined to see this tax pass. And then the other big piece that he wants to do is infrastructure. The reconciliation, the stimulus bill right now is sort of the American Recovery Act, or sorry, the American Rescue Plan, and the infrastructure will be the American Recovery Plan. And they're planning a very, very ambitious, probably $2 to $2.5 trillion package to rebuild America and to create a lot of good jobs. And it is very, very focused on green technology. So let me quickly talk about three broad areas that'll be in this infrastructure package. And there's overlap between them, but just to kind of lay it out in a pretty structural way, there's traditional infrastructure, repairs and construction of roads and bridges and airports and rail lines, water supply systems, modernizing our schools. They want to create a rail revolution, connecting our cities with higher speed rail, and provide every city of over 100,000 residents with clean, accessible public transportation. And then there's green infrastructure, clean automobile networks, big focus on electronic vehicles, the greening of commercial office spaces, issuing new fuel economy standards, investing in clean energy and technology, including new battery storage mechanisms. And then finally, social policy and equity infrastructure. And this includes expanding broadband access with a focus on rural and other underserved, underprivileged areas, targeting water systems in some disadvantaged communities around the country, trying to level up marginalized communities, money for public housing in America, and promoting small and medium-sized farms. So this is going to be a massive infrastructure bill. Again, we don't think they'll get enough Republicans on board. They will balk at the price tag. I mean, by the way, Donald Trump talked about infrastructure all the time, and even with the Republican president and Republican Senate, they couldn't get anything done. So this will get done, we think, again, by the budget reconciliation process, so they can do it without any Republican votes. Because they're already using budget reconciliation for stimulus right now, they'll have to wait till the new budget year starts in October. But President Biden is going to start talking about this fairly soon. He's not talking a lot about it right now because he doesn't want to muddy the waters. He's focused on stimulus and he wants people to focus on stimulus. Once stimulus is done, the president will give, it's not called a State of the Union address during a president's first term, but an address to the joint sessions of Congress, probably late March. And at that time, we think he will lay out his tax plan and lay out this infrastructure plan. And the focus, again, will be on creating good, solid union jobs in America, a green, they're not going to call it Green New Deal, but it'll be certainly a green tech revolution in America to both create jobs and create the factories to create the technology, but also to help us meet some of our climate targets. So that's kind of the domestic plan this year: stimulus, taxes, and infrastructure. Now, in the House, we're going to see a whole lot of legislation coming out in the next couple of weeks. They've got bills coming out on voting rights, on gun control, on police reform, on labor rights. Those are all going to die in the Senate. They're not going to get anywhere. It used to be those bills in the last 2 years didn't get anywhere in the Senate because they get to the Senate after being passed in the Democratic House. And Mitch McConnell, who controlled the flow of legislation in the Senate, just sat on them, wouldn't bring them up. There'll be pressure on Chuck Schumer to bring some of them up. But he has to weigh, if he knows he's not going to get 10 Republicans on board on some of these things, and things like gun control and voting rights, he's not going to, how much energy and how much sort of political capital does he want to spend trying to address those issues if he knows they're not going to get done. And he's got a line, again, between the progressives in his caucus, who will push him very hard to bring these up for a vote, if for no other reason to get the Republicans on record as voting against them, and the moderates in his caucus who don't want to vote on things like gun control. So it'll be interesting to watch, but the bottom line is that all that legislation is not going to go anywhere in the Senate. We think the only things that really pass this year of really substantial consequence are stimulus, taxes, and then infrastructure. A quick note on foreign policy. There's a real shift I've noticed in this administration to a focus on what foreign policy means for domestic policy. And I was on a Zoom call with the new National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, just 2 days before inauguration. And he really said, he made this point that foreign policy equals domestic policy. And we have to have a foreign policy that benefits the middle class in America, that helps to shore up our infrastructure and our middle class and our working class. So it'll be a very different, somewhat different approach to foreign policy, looking at it through that lens. And I just want to mention in that context, the appointment of Susan Rice to run the Domestic Policy Council out of the White House. It was a very interesting choice because Susan Rice has 100% of her life experiences in the foreign policy realm. And she had been thought of as a possible national security advisor or possible secretary of state. So people were very surprised at first when she was named to run the Domestic Policy Council. But it's an indication of this, this tie-in between domestic and foreign policy that we're going to see for the next 4 years. And I will say that the Office of Domestic Policy is an office that has traditionally had a bit of a reputation for being sort of disorganized and all over the map. And Susan Rice will bring discipline and process to that office. And I think we're going to see a very lashed up operation from a procedural and policy perspective at the White House, fusing domestic and international policy with Susan Rice and Jake Sullivan. And then finally, just a couple quick words on US-UK relations, since many of us are sitting here in London. There was a lot of concern after the election that Joe Biden would not be very friendly toward the UK, that he and his team around him were not fans of Brexit. They didn't like Boris Johnson, that his team was very much focused on Europe and the EU and had a lot of personal and professional ties to the EU. I think that hasn't been borne out. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson was the first phone call to a leader that Biden made outside of North America. The teams are already talking about ways that they can collaborate, and I think the United States the team there is learning early on that it's much easier to deal and work with a sort of standalone UK, if you will, than it is with a big bureaucracy in Brussels. And I think the real areas, and I think the British government has done a good job of being quite aggressive in laying out the ways that they can work with the United States. They've boosted their defense budget, which is always important to the United States, but more broadly on issues, especially around China and climate change. And the UK, it's also lucky that it's hosting the G7 in June and hosting the COP26 climate conference in November. Both of those will be very important opportunities for the United States and the United Kingdom to sort of further their bonds together and to identify areas to work together. But Joe Biden is very clearly focused on climate change as a top concern, and Boris Johnson has done a good job, I think, of playing into that, and also it's a top concern for him too. And then addressing China, which is probably the greatest strategic threat that the United States, or maybe challenge is a better word, the greatest strategic challenge that the United States is facing in the next 4 years. And there's a real opportunity for the UK to be a strong partner of the United States in trying to find ways to manage, in a very important trading relationship and an international security relationship with China, while at the same time pushing back on China's military aggression and addressing human rights in China, which has not been a focus of US foreign policy over the last 4 years, but it certainly is now. So that's about half an hour in. So let me stop there and open up for questions.
Lew, very, very comprehensive. You covered a ton of territory in 26 minutes, so very well done. We do have quite a few questions on the group chat, so I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. If anyone wants to ask a question more anonymously, feel free to send me an email. It's jason@signumglobal.com. But Lew, for the first sort of two-pronged question, we're getting a lot of interest in the elections, both the midterms and 2024. You said for the midterms, generally it's not great for the incumbents. Can you maybe give us a view of what the map both on the Senate and the House side might look like? We're not going to hold you to it because it's early days. And then come 2024, ideas on Trump. Obviously, he made some noise this last weekend, and will Biden run again?
So thank you. On the midterm elections, so right now the numbers in the Congress, there are 435 representatives in the Congress. Right now the numbers are 221 Democrats, 211 Republicans. There are 5 vacant seats. There are 3 Democrats who have been pulled from their seats by the president to take jobs in Washington, 2 in the cabinet, 1 in the White House. And then there are 2 Republican congressmen who've died in the last month and a half from COVID. So there's 5 empty seats, and there'll be 5 elections this year. We think after those special elections are held, the numbers will be 222 Democrats to 213 Republicans. So the Republicans are 9 seats behind. But what that means is that the Republicans, the Democrats can only afford to lose 4 or 5 votes from their caucus on any issue. So the Republicans, it is true sort of historically that the opposition party gains seats in first midterms. The Republicans are certainly very focused on that. Kevin McCarthy very much wants to be back in control of the House. And the way they're going to do that is by running aggressively against Joe Biden's agenda. They're going to say that the Democrats are spending too much money, that they're pushing a socialist agenda. And that's pretty much it. Like, that's going to be their main talking point, I think. In the Senate, I haven't done the deep dive analysis yet, but it's 50-50. So neither party can afford to net lose 1 seat in the next election. There are a couple toss-up seats. There are a couple of senators retiring. The one that'll be most interesting to watch is Pennsylvania. Pat Toomey is resigning next year. He's not going to run again. That's a possible pickup for the Democrats. But the Democrats are also holding or facing some challengers in some difficult seats, including in Arizona and in Georgia. So it's going to be a very tight election. And we think that the last election was incredibly expensive. The money that's going to be spent next year on these midterms is going to be unbelievable, because it really will determine if the Republicans take either the House or the Senate. Joe Biden will get nothing done on the legislative front his second half of his 4 years. It just, he needs to have Democrats in control of both those bodies to be able to get anything done. So they're going to be hugely, hugely important. On 2024, look, there are already some Republicans pretty openly running. I mean, Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, a couple senators, people like that, Nikki Haley also, Mike Pompeo. But they're all in the shadow of Donald Trump for now. And Donald Trump hinted on Sunday that he would run again. We don't think he will actually run again, but we think he may say he is, and use it as a way to travel the country and raise money for the next couple of years. He enjoys that sort of being in the limelight, being the center of attention, doing rallies with his adoring crowds, and he can raise a lot of money doing that. So whether he actually runs or not, he will, I think, certainly signal that he plans to, and keep everyone else guessing and waiting. And because none of those people that I just listed, the Republican senators and people like Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley and maybe Mike Pence, none of them can afford to be seen as challenging President Trump in a pre-primary or a primary process. So they're all sort of biding their time. They're they're signaling that they're interested. They're certainly posturing. And we see this in some of the confirmation hearings and in some of the hearings going on the Hill right now. But it's kind of a wait and see game for the Republicans to see whether Trump runs again or not. And then I forgot, Don Jr. is another person whose name is being touted as a possible nominee.
That's great. Thanks, Lew. One quick clarification. You mentioned higher taxes on foreign earned income. You're referring to corporates and not individuals. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. Corporates.
Great, great. Turning to foreign policy again, we've gotten a couple questions on both Russia and Saudi Arabia. We've seen some change in terms of style, but what about substance for both Russia and Saudi Arabia?
So I think both those relationships will be much more difficult relationships under a Biden administration than they were under the Trump administration. We've just seen new sanctions in Russia, and I think there'll be much less tolerance for Russia's sort of aggressive or unhelpful behavior. That said, this administration has already shown a capability, and I knew they would because of who's coming in and their experience, but the capability to address bilateral relationships in a much more sort of whole of government and holistic manner. And what I mean by that is that they're able to sort of, criticize Russia for human rights abuses and sanction, folks in Russia who are up to no good, while at the same time, working on nuclear treaties, for example. So there's an ability to sort of multitask and see things multidimensionally that I think was lacking a bit in the last administration. Saudi Arabia is a difficult one, and as you know, it's pretty well documented that Donald Trump's first trip overseas as president was to Saudi Arabia. His son-in-law Jared Kushner was very close to the Crown Prince, MBS, in Saudi Arabia, and President Biden and his team promised to recalibrate the relationship with Saudi Arabia, and they did that last week on Friday, releasing the unclassified version of the ODNI report on the Khashoggi murder, which clearly implicated the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. They sanctioned about 75 Saudis who were involved, stopped offensive arms sales to Saudi Arabia that were being used on the war in Yemen. So, a big step forward or backward, depending on your point of view in the relationship. Now, the president all weekend long came under intense criticism, including from within his own party, for not sanctioning the Crown Prince himself. Now, I thought about this a lot over the weekend. The fact of the matter is that the Crown Prince will be king of Saudi Arabia, possibly while Joe Biden is still president, and will probably be king for 30, 40, 50 years. He's only in his mid-30s right now. And the United States doesn't always get to choose leaders with whom it has to work. So I think they actually did a very solid job of walking that fine line between making it clear that we know MBS was responsible, sanctioning a lot of people around him. He's certainly not going to get any red carpet visits to the United States anytime soon. The president wouldn't talk to him. President Trump talked to him. Our president said, look, my counterpart is the king, not the Crown Prince. His counterpart is the Secretary of Defense. If he wants to have a conversation with someone, he talks to Lloyd Austin, not to me. A huge sort of humiliation of MBS. And I think, the president walked that fine line. He couldn't sanction the MBS because, when the guy becomes king, Saudi Arabia at the end of the day is an incredibly important and strategic partner, given its geography and its the role as a sort of counterweight to Iran in the region. So I think the president did the right thing there. But it was interesting to see him come under a lot of criticism, including from within his own party on that.
And what about the perennial wild card, Kim Jong-un?
Yeah, he's been very quiet. Interestingly enough, he would use the first couple of weeks of an administration to try to stir up some trouble. He hasn't seemed to have done that, and I'm not going to try to pretend to get inside his head and try to say why he's being relatively quiet. He may have a surprise for us down the road. He's very unpredictable, as we all know, and I'm sure that the new team is keeping an eye on it. But so far, it's been very quiet. Knock on wood.
Yeah. Might have to do with his health as well. We'll see. Going back to the regulatory environment, any ideas on changes to financial services? I'll expand this question a little bit, both in terms of the GameStop Reddit controversy a couple of weeks ago, but also as big techs encroach into financial services.
You're probably better to answer that than I am, Jason. You want to take that one?
Well, what Charles Myers, our chairman, has been suggesting is that we will indeed see increased scrutiny when it particularly comes to consumer finance. but don't expect massive regulatory changes in response to this. There will also be some changes in terms of, the uptick rule, perhaps some additional requirements when it comes to margin, but it's really more enforcement of current regulations that are already on the books.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just add that, a lot of the key people who will be in leadership roles in the different government regulatory agencies and bodies are in the process of going through their confirmation hearings and coming on board right now. So it's still a little bit early days. And I think as these people come in, get confirmed, come into their offices, put together their senior leadership teams, and start addressing the issues, I think some of these possible regulatory changes will become clearer.
Lew, here's a more fun one, and I'm gonna ask it verbatim. How did you maintain your impartiality and equanimity during your years with the State Department, given unpredictable political machinations through 5 presidencies?
Well, I mean, the reality is that Foreign Service officers take an oath of office, the same oath that all senior American officials take to the Constitution, and foreign policy doesn't normally change that much from administration to administration. It was different under President Trump. There's certainly a huge change in tone and in attitude, and I think that was probably of all the transitions that I was involved in, that was the most challenging as a Foreign Service officer. I'm trying to explain to governments, certainly in the case here in the UK, why the president was attacking the mayor of London or attacking the prime minister on Twitter is not something that I ever thought I would have to do in the Foreign Service. And I think I'll venture a guess that most of my former colleagues in the State Department breathed a huge sigh of relief on January 20th when Joe Biden came in, and we've gone back to sort of a more sort of normal channels and a more traditional form of diplomacy and communication between governments. But at the end of the day, Foreign Service officers around the world are focused on ensuring the prosperity and security of the American people. And that, has always been a priority and doesn't normally change from administration to administration.
Good answer, a true pro. Well done. Maybe fleshing out a couple of topics that you've already mentioned in your remarks. First, timing for U.S.-UK trade, potential deal. If you could flesh that out a little bit, and then also, a lot of Europeans are investing in U.S. clean energy revolution. What are the expectations for Biden's very ambitious climate goals? So
on the U.S.-UK trade agreement, I think it's probably going nowhere right now, and for a couple of reasons. One is we've said it as a firm for a year now that with the change of administration, it'll get pushed back. But even more so now. So it was sort of halfway through the negotiation process, I guess, and the new trade representative hasn't even been confirmed yet. She's had her hearing, but she hasn't been confirmed, I don't think. She will be soon if she's not already. But it takes a while, again, for her to get her team together and to focus on trade priorities. And the reality is that Joe Biden's real focus on the U.S. domestic market and rebuilding the U.S. economy will make it more difficult to sign trade agreements, because everything will be seen through a lens of, does this help rebuild America and does it help the American worker? And trade deals by their nature involve a lot of give and take. And my sense from this administration is that they're not going to want to do a lot of giving in the give and take equation. That said, I always felt a little bit that the US-UK trade agreement was a little bit overblown. Trade between the two countries is so strong and so robust, and the economic benefits or the financial benefits of a trade agreement were always going to be sort of marginal. And I think this new administration in Washington is just going to make the decision that this is not where they want to focus their energy on right now, on this sort of comprehensive US-UK trade agreement. There may be opportunity, and I'm just sort of going out on a limb here, for much more targeted sort of sectoral agreements on particular areas, whether it's around technology or finances, financial services. But I think a US-UK comprehensive trade agreement is, I don't want to say dead on the water, because that's a little bit too definitive, but certainly we're not going to see anything this year and maybe not even next year. On the green tech and the sort of opportunities, look, I mean, if the U.S. government, if this bill passes at the end of this year, which we think it will, we're talking about $2.5 trillion going into projects in the United States with a huge focus on green technology and energy. So I think there will be lots of opportunities for investment. I mean, we think that renewables is going to be one of the areas or one of the sectors that's going to do well under President Biden. They're going to have to deal with some supply chain issues. I mean, this is the struggle right now: is do you want to buy cheap solar panels from China, or do you want to create factories and produce more expensive solar panels in the United States? The Biden team's inclination will be to do the latter, but that takes time. So there's a trade-off between speed and bringing all these jobs back to the United States, and that'll be part of the process of writing this legislation. But certainly there's, I think, only an upside for investment in green tech in the United States.
Great answer. We've got a question circling back to US-China. What leverage, if any, does Biden have when it comes to conquering China, when it comes to human rights? And let's talk about both, Xinjiang as well as Hong Kong.
Well, this is the challenge, right? There's not that much leverage, and the United States has to balance this incredibly important trading relationship with China, as well as trying to sort of counteract China's military expansion in the South China Sea and beyond, with criticism of human rights. And I think China expects that they'll come under some criticism. The question is really, how far does it go? And do you start sanctioning companies, for example, that do business or that buy products made in potential or impossible prison camps in Xinjiang province? So there are a lot of options on the table. And I think what will happen is, and I saw this under the Obama administration, and I did a trip to China with then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. They set up, the Obama administration set up what they call the Strategic Economic Dialogue with China, and they would bring in Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and they would meet around the table with their Chinese counterparts. And they did it once a year in China, and then they did it once a year, alternating between China and the United States. And the goal was to get all the issues on the table and address them in a whole of government approach. So you weren't just talking trade, or you weren't just talking military, you weren't just talking human rights. You had all the people around the table that needed to be there. And it proved to be a fairly effective way to break the ice and to tackle some of these issues. Under President Trump, we saw very clear focus on trade and a move away from that holistic approach. And I think my guess is that the new team, many of whom were involved in those talks under the Obama administration, will want to go back to a more comprehensive approach to the relationship with China. So I don't want to sort of start guessing at what they might do. Certainly, tariffs are a possibility. Public condemnation of the human rights situation in China is an easy one, but doesn't really accomplish anything. And then dealing with China's military, and then technology and intellectual property theft, and there's just such a wide range of issues. And at the end of the day, the United States has to be able to work with China in a constructive and productive way, because there's really no option to that. Otherwise, China goes off on their own, and we lose all leverage. So the team in Washington right now is trying to figure out, how do we maximize our potential leverage without, while still being able to address the issues that are important to us.
Very helpful. A lot of really good questions, by the way. Here's one that I'm personally curious about. How will Biden clean up his inconsistencies with trade unions in the US? Let's go ahead and expand that to all unions in the US as well.
What I'm not sure what they mean by inconsistencies with trade unions.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Biden has always been a strong supporter of unions. He made a quite remarkable public statement over the weekend about I think the workers in Amazon workers in Alabama are voting on whether to create or form a union or not. And there's some pressure from the company on the workers not to. And there's sort of pretty extraordinary intervention by the president, saying that the workers really must be able to make that decision on their own without any pressure from the company, from Amazon. But so I'm not sure what the questioner meant by inconsistencies. Maybe that person can send another note in.
They did, yeah. They're talking specifically, for example, about Keystone, which eliminated millions of union jobs.
Keystone, actually, there's a sort of a bit of a myth out there that Keystone would have provided millions of these jobs. Over the course of the construction of Keystone, it would have created about, I think about 1,500 jobs over the course of the next 3 years. And all those jobs would have gone away as soon as the construction was finished. And at the end of the day, the Keystone Pipeline would have created 30 to 50 full-time, good paying, but only 30 to 50 full-time jobs in the United States. So it's not, I don't see that as an inconsistency. I mean, Biden has to weigh job creation and union jobs against the green technology and the sort of the climate change promises that he's made or the ambitions that he has. And I think Keystone was a pretty clear case where he decided that the disadvantage of canceling a couple thousand jobs that would only have existed for a few years versus the political benefit and the environmental benefit of getting rid of the pipeline, that he came down on the side of the pipeline. But I wouldn't necessarily call that an inconsistency.
How about teachers union and his approach supporting safe back to school?
I mean, I assume in the context of COVID, look, that's an area that honestly I'm not completely read up on. I know that there's, the school situation in America is difficult because basically schools are controlled by the public school districts in every state and every district. So the federal government has very little sort of authority to force schools to either to reopen or to stay closed. And I think what the president has done is encourage schools to abide by CDC guidelines. He made it clear yesterday, I think, that teachers should be at the front of the line in states to get vaccinated so they can get back to work. So that's I don't really have anything else to add besides that.
That's helpful. And I see that Karen Abbott, who helped us organize this, did offer a question. I want Karen to have the option to go ahead and turn on her camera. I don't want to put you on the spot, Karen, but if you'd like, feel free to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, I've just been asking some questions about, I think you've already answered one, Lew, about how achievable is this really ambitious clean energy agenda? Because if there's such a problem with the partisan mood in Congress, which won't go away anytime soon, it seems to me that achieving Biden's very ambitious climate goals is going to rest in the hands of executive orders and the administrative agencies. When we've already seen so many agencies starting to take actions to try and implement those goals, it seems to me it's all going to take a long time before a lot of these actions bear fruit and investors can take advantage of the situation. Do you agree with that, or?
Well, I mean, yes, I think there's a two-pronged approach, right? They will do as much as they can through executive order and through agency action and regulatory action by the agencies that doesn't require legislation. But we do think that this infrastructure package will pass toward the end of this year, even with the bipartisan or the lack of bipartisanship in Washington, because they have 50 senators plus the vice president as tiebreaker. They can do that through the budget reconciliation process. And we think they will. And their goal, Joe Biden's goal, is to be able to go into next year's midterm elections, showing that the Democrats have created jobs, have rolled out an effective vaccination program, got people back to school and back to work. The economy will be coming out of a slump. People will be spending money again. And then he'll be able to say, look, we're creating all these great jobs across the country in construction and in technology and building new companies or factories to build this technology, whether it's wind turbines or solar panels or whatever. So we think it will happen, and they're going to try and front load. I mean, infrastructure spending is always difficult because it takes place over years, and people talk a lot about shovel-ready projects, and the reality is that those projects are often not that shovel-ready, and it takes a while for the investment to filter down. I will say, and this is that our boss Charles Myers was on a call. Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, is probably going to be the point person to coordinate all this investment across the country. And he is incredibly not just intelligent and effective but he will be incredibly motivated because that's an opportunity for him, a very young and up and coming politician, to really make his name. So he will lead a team of people in the government who will work really hard to make sure that once this money passes through the Senate and the president signs it into law later this year, that the money gets out as quickly and as effectively as possible across the country.
But where do you think the money is going to come from? Is it going to be heavily dependent on the corporate tax increases?
It'll be a combination of deficit spending and the corporate tax increases. Yes.
Okay. And okay, well, hopefully the Republicans won't put up too much of a fight on that, I suppose.
They will, but it'll still pass.
Yeah, it'll still pass. So you're still positive about that. Okay, that's good to know. One other final question I had was, how much of a role do you think the US will play in international financial organizations under Biden, which could be important when we're all looking at issues of ESG and data privacy and so on?
Well, I think the US is completely re-engaging with international institutions and multilateral institutions, whether it's, you know, the WHO on trade issues or yeah, I mean, whether it's trade or health issues, the UN in general, we rejoined the Human Rights Council. So look, the United States is sort of back at the table. It'll take a while, I think, to rebuild trust. And I will say, and some of the people here on this call who are over here in Europe are maybe picking up on this. There's a level of mistrust, I think, in Europe, in a sense of, you know, this is all great and good, but how do we know we're not going to have a President Ted Cruz in 4 years who's going to pull the U.S. out of everything again and reverse everything Joe Biden has done? And I get that. I mean, I think it's natural that our allies are a little bit skeptical, appreciative of what Joe Biden's doing, but a little bit skeptical about how long it lasts. But that said, I think the United States is re-engaging in all these institutions, and I think we'll continue to see that over the next 4 years.
And of course, Biden embracing of climate change after the Trump era will also help with that as well in terms of America's acceptance.
Yep.
So if I may combine for your last question, Lew, two on the thread here. Looking out again at 2024, what role do you see Kamala playing for the next 3.5, 4 years? And I know as a centrist Democrat who's involved in fundraising, the dream ticket amongst many is Kamala Buttigieg. Any thoughts there? And then I'll let you close with any final remarks.
Yeah, look, that's a very appealing ticket. I mean, first of all, Joe Biden has not said that he's not running again, right? He hinted at that at one point during the campaign, and I think his team very quickly told him to knock it off. So he, as far as we know today, Joe Biden will run again. That said, realistically, I think it's quite possible that he decides not to run again. It's been quite amazing to watch how involved Kamala Harris has been in this administration so far. And Joe Biden has really made a point to have her front and center in almost every meeting, every photo op. She is there. She has a weekly lunch with Tony Blinken. She's getting briefed up on foreign policy issues. She already knows how the Senate works, but she's really getting a crash course in how to be at the top levels of government. And part of that, there's an interesting article over the weekend says that part of it comes from the way Joe Biden was treated by President Obama at first. And everyone sort of remembers those two being great buddies and very, very close, but it wasn't that case in the beginning. And there are a couple of instances where Joe Biden felt that President Obama was not including him in important decisions. And that changed over time. But Biden has made a real point to include Kamala Harris in almost every meeting and every decision. And I think part of the reason for that is to set her up to be able to run as the heir apparent. If Joe Biden announces he's not going to run, she's not, 100% shoo-in to be the nominee. She would certainly be challenged in a Democratic primary, but I think she would be in an incredibly strong position coming from the vice president's seat with the experience that she's gaining. And I think she would be the nominee. Whether she picks Pete Buttigieg as her VP or someone else remains to be seen. But I very much see her at the top of the ticket, possibly in 4 years.
Great. And with that, I did promise a hard stop at the hour. We have about 2 minutes left. If anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me at jason@signumglobal.com. But otherwise, Lloyd, Karen, Lew, any final remarks?
No, I just want to say thank you all for the opportunity. It's great to be with you all this evening, and thanks for the great questions.
And thank you, Lew and Jason. It was fabulous, and hopefully we can do this again.
Great, thank you.
Without a doubt.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Karen, for organising this on behalf of the club.
Thank you. Bye.